Hello, my name's Janet Wood and I'm the editor of Utility Week magazine. Today I'm talking to Mike Nugent, partner at EC Harris, about some of the challenges facing the water sector as we move towards the next price review. We'll be seeing a lot of work from companies and from the regulator Ofwat over the next year as they prepare for the price review. What do you think will be the industry's biggest concern and how should the companies prepare themselves?
I think the prime concern is actually going to be around data and benchmarking. Now that we don't have the June returns, there's not a lot of data available for companies to really work out what their unit costs are and how they actually compare with other companies. And that's going to be a big concern in terms of putting forward a competent and coherent business plan. Equally, future price limits. We really don't know what's coming out of those, what that means for the companies and how they're actually going to manage the PR14 submissions. And finally, around risk-based regulation, what is going to be the modus operandi of companies working with Ofwat and how are they expected to interact both through the submission but also through AMP6?
There is a partial replacement for the June returns in the form of key performance indicators. Do you think companies will have a bit more to go on when they see performance against those KPIs?
The real challenge though is that the KPIs are really around outcomes, around customers and environment and some high-level financial data, but actually the real detail for comparisons is not there anymore. So companies are going to actually find it quite difficult to say whether they put forward a unit cost that's going to be acceptable and is going to be good compared to other companies. They're going to be working in a little bit more of a vacuum around that.
In the next price review, companies will be judged on outcomes for customers rather than measures like the number of miles of pipe laid. That gives them a lot more chance to try new ways of doing things. What do they need to do to be ready for that challenge?
I think the issue here is to make sure that we're not really losing sight of the fact that the business plans still need to be very well thought through and based on significant amounts of data. So just because it's now on outcomes doesn't mean that there's less data. If anything, it probably means that they need to produce more data because if things go wrong and Ofwat needs to intervene or feels the need to intervene, they're going to need to have more information and more backup to show that they're actually managing their risks effectively.
Some companies do innovate already. I'm sure they'd all want to put their hands up to that.
Absolutely, and I think that's a fair judgment, but I think the key thing under the new regime is that we're still pretty unclear exactly how the rewards for outcomes are going to work. So until we're clear exactly what benefits they're going to be for companies, how much they're going to invest in innovation is going to be a big question.
With this change to outcomes, companies will be able to be more inventive in their solutions. But doesn't that mean they're going to need even more information about their infrastructure, what condition it's in and how it's working?
Yeah, the risk to companies is that if they try out new solutions, Ofwat are going to want to monitor those more closely. And if things don't actually work out as projected, then that might actually result in a deep dive from Ofwat into their organisation. And that means they're going to need to produce more information. They're going to have to be really clear on exactly how they're managing the risks around that opportunity or that issue and how they actually manage that with customer outcomes.
Is it possible that companies will find that some of their most familiar assets are least well understood in terms of searchable data? It may all be in people's heads.
I think that's right. I think there is a potential issue around asset information and the accessibility of that to all of the partners that work with a water company. So actually making sure there's a single place for asset information, the data, the condition and the location is going to be really important to make sure that companies can manage issues effectively under a risk-based regime.
Ofwat has introduced the concept of total expenditure rather than OPEX and CAPEX, so companies don't have big capital projects as their first option. Instead, they look more closely at whole life costing, and it should bring in more innovation. How should companies respond to that?
I think this is a big issue. I think companies are now going to have to be thinking more about capital maintenance rather than OPEX and CAPEX management. So actually thinking about the whole life cost is going to be a big concern for companies. But unfortunately, we're still back at the same problem again around uncertainty. We still don't really know exactly how this TOTEX regime is actually going to work. And we're going to have to wait some time before we really know how companies are going to have to respond to that through their PR14 submissions.
When do you think we'll have some clarity on that TOTEX regime?
Well, Ofwat's next steps paper around future price limits puts a timetable in place and it talks in terms of autumn this year. But really, companies could do with some clarity before then, I think, to really make sure they understand exactly how they're going to respond.
With the water bill in the background, there's a lot of uncertainty, and that makes it difficult for companies to plan for the price review. How can they manage that uncertainty?
Well, the date for PR14 submissions isn't changing, so companies need to get cracking and moving with their submissions. An approach we're seeing out in the marketplace is companies are taking a two-pronged approach. First, they're doing their submissions based on PR09 and building them on that basis. Secondly, they're also thinking about, well, what is our best guess of what is likely to come out of all of the legislation and the changes from Ofwat? And then over time, as we get greater clarity over the summer months and into autumn, then companies can draw that together into a single response. The key issue here, of course, is going to be about resources and time. There's not a lot of time, and taking a two-pronged approach takes up a lot more time and effort.
It's a complex task for those companies. You've seen how a few other industries manage through change. Any last thoughts for water companies?
Yeah, I think there are three key areas we would focus on. There's integration, preparation, and communication. So integration, getting the full business plan sorted, thinking about the target operating model for how that's going to work, how you're actually going to contract with the market, and really make sure that you're clear as to where you stand relative to your competitors, and that pulls together into an integrated plan. Preparation, this is all about actually thinking about all of the eventualities, making sure that companies are tapped into what's going on and they're engaged in the process with Ofwat over the summer so that they can influence and understand exactly what Ofwat is planning and how they actually expect companies to work with them over the period for AMP6. And finally, communication. Under risk-based regulation, I think it's really important to build really good, strong relationships with Ofwat and really making sure that they understand where the companies are coming from, what their plans are, and why they're planning to do things in certain ways. Ultimately, bringing together those three areas, integration, preparation, and communication, means that the water companies can satisfy the customers, the stakeholders, and the regulator going forward.
There's plenty for water companies to think about. This has been Janet Wood of Utility Week magazine, talking to Mike Nugent, partner at EC Harris, about the challenges facing the water companies. Mike, thanks very much.
Thank you.